Hello and welcome to Production Bytes. I'm your host Nick, and today I'm going to be covering ImageLine's Newtone. FL Studio 10 introduced Newtone, and with FL 11 it's been updated to version 2. Along with refinements, it brings some key new features, notably the time stretching mode and vibrato editor. I've also had a load of requests recently to cover it, so here we go. Newtone is per-note pitch correction software, much like Melodin, although I think personally with a much nicer interface. It's very simple to use, you just drag in some monophonic audio, and Newtone chews through it before presenting you with a display not unlike a piano roll. From here you can change every note manually, or use some of the automatic functions to have some of the work done for you. The interface is dead easy to use, but much like its big brother FL Studio, has a lot of powerful features buried away for us power users. The main panel is where you'll spend most of your time, and displays the detected notes from the audio source. The line running through every note displays the pitch, and the box around it displays the average pitch across the entire note's pitch curve. The blob of white, of course, is Newtone's representation of the waveform. To move around quickly, click down the middle mouse button and drag. You can also zoom horizontally and vertically by holding the Ctrl and Alt buttons and then rolling the mouse wheel respectively. And Newtone also shares a lot of the same controls as you'd find in the playlist and piano roll. For instance, holding Ctrl and then right-clicking will zoom you all the way out, and then holding Ctrl and right-click dragging a box around a section will zoom you into that section. To change the pitch for notes, all you have to do is hover over it until your cursor changes to an up or down arrow, then just click and grab it and drag it where you want it to go. You can also quantize the average pitch of a note by right-clicking on it, and move the pitch finally by holding down Alt and then clicking and dragging. Sometimes Newtone misdetects note start or end times, or you just want a different level of control. For this you have the slice tool. You can switch this on manually using the panel at the top, or press C to activate it. However, you can just hold Shift down to momentarily activate it. As with the rest of FL, if you don't want to be limited by the grid, you can hold Alt in conjunction with this to switch off snapping. To do the opposite of slicing two notes and tie two notes together though, just hold Ctrl while in cut mode, then click on the two notes you want to join. You'll now see that they both join into one pitch average box. Double click on a note and you'll bring up the advanced edit display, which I'll cover a bit later on. In the top left, you have your play and stop buttons, and a loop button, which is handy if you want to drag a selection around something and just loop it. Top right are some global pitch control knobs and common settings. The center control globally quantizes every note's average pitch to the nearest note. The variation control increases or decreases the pitch variation from the average of every note. And transition tightens up the transition speed between separate notes. To get heavy auto-tune style effects across your entire vocal, these are the only three controls you need to crank up.
They're breaking floods of tears.
Below these knobs are the switches to activate cut mode, the advanced edit mode, slaved playback mode, which causes what's in Newtone to play whenever FL is playing, and auto scroll mode, which defaults to on and relentlessly keeps the playhead in sight. The remaining switches are the file menu, the edit menu, the select menu, and the undo button, the first three of which contain a lot of tucked away features. Then you have four switches which provide different ways to use or save the audio, center piano roll, which sends all the detected notes as MIDI to the selected channel in FL, the save button saves the audio to .wav or .wavpack, and then drag selection allows you to drag the selected portion of audio or entire audio sample straight into your playlist or Windows Explorer. Finally, send to playlist places the selected portion or entire audio sample into the playlist. That's the interface done then, so let's go play with the features and show off some of the more advanced functions I haven't discussed here. So here I've got the stems from one of my tracks. If you want to hear the finished product just for reference, there is a link in the description that I'd recommend you go check out. But basically, I've pulled three layers from my track Phoenix. Firstly, the basic instrumental. I've discovered this is an older version of the instrumental and some of the melodies and mix did change for release, but it shouldn't have an impact on the vocal. Secondly, the processed backing vocals for the track. This is so I can switch them in and out for you guys so you can hear the main vocal that I'm working on its own. And thirdly, I've pulled out an unprocessed stem for the lead vocal, which is quite out of tune in places and therefore it's ideal for what we're doing here. So with that said, let's jump in. This is what the section of the track sounds like without the lead vocal.
She'll be free.
Okay, so now that you've heard what the produced side of the track sounds like, this is what it sounds like with the raw vocal in.
They're breaking floods of tears. We burned her to the ground just to be free. She'll be free. She'll be free.
Right, so hopefully you can hear that that is quite out of tune in places, especially on the first and last phrases, if I just solo that.
In Demon's grounds,
That's completely wrong, and also on the last phrase.
she'll be free.
So there's a few ways which we can go about editing this now. Firstly, I can click up in the top left-hand corner of the clip and hit pitch correct sample. And I can also bring up Newtone manually and bring it straight in. And you'll see Newtone was quickly chewing through the audio there. It's only a short section, so it only takes a moment. But on longer audio files, it can take longer to chew through it all, and you'll have to be a bit patient. However, once you have chewed through it once, it does save a little ZPA file next to the original WAV file, which saves all of the data that Newtone needs in order to bring it up instantly in the future. So, if I double click on the bar at the top, this will now make Newtone full screen. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to switch off scroll to follow cursor, because I personally find this very annoying. If I'm trying to work on a little section, I don't want to accidentally, while I'm working, have the playhead go off screen and then suddenly the whole screen moves. So I tend to switch that off. If you've seen my tutorial on Melodin, you'll definitely have a head start on this, and you'll know a few more techniques than I'm going to be showing here today, as this tutorial is to show how to use Newtone, not how to pitch correct vocals. So just focusing on this first phrase.
In Demon's grounds, they're breaking floods of tears.
You can hear it's more or less pretty good, however this one note is way out. And I've got a few ways which I can deal with the tuning of the vocals. The first way is the automatic way, and I can do this by using these three controls up here which I explained earlier. The center control I would start by dragging all the way up, and what that does is it tightens all the average pitches straight onto a note. So now this sounds like this.
In Demon's grounds, they're breaking floods of tears.
So that's much better. I can also use the variation control to flatten out the pitch curbs.
In Demon's grounds, they're breaking floods of tears.
However, that doesn't sound particularly natural, and therefore I could increase it a little bit. I can also mess around with the transition control a bit, but generally all this does is serves to worsen the auto-tune effect as it tightens up the transitions between notes.
In Demon's grounds, they're breaking floods of tears. They're breaking floods of tears.
You can hear especially on this note here, the transition control makes it very, very sharp and sound very tuned. So I'm going to leave that at full for the sake of it sounding natural. In this case though, I'm also going to reset the variation control, as I don't really want that to be done automatically. What I'd like to do here is have a lot more powerful control. And this is where the advanced mode comes in. So if I double click on a note, you can see this brings up a whole load more controls. Along the top are the first three controls. Right in the middle, we've got the volume control, and if you grab this at the top here, it allows you to make the whole note louder or quieter. On the left, you have a volume control for the fade in, and with this handle you can control where the fade ends, and this controls the actual fade level. So you can see on the waveform what that's doing.
Grounds.
The same is true for the control on the right, except this is a fade out handle. And you can increase or decrease the volume on both of these. If we move down to the middle, here you can still move the pitch up and down. However, moving over to the left, we've now got a note move control, so you can move that around as you want. That's useful for fixing timing, obviously. On the far right, we have a formant control, which is related to throat size. If I turn it up a bit, for instance, then it's going to sound a bit more female and a bit smaller throated. And if I turn it down, it's going to sound a lot more male and a lot larger throated. But again, let's just set that back to 0. Now down at the bottom are the really useful controls for fixing pitch. In the middle, we've got a variation control, which if you click in the middle and drag it, you can see does exactly the same as the variation control up here, just per note. So that gives you a lot more power. And in the case of this note, if I want it to stay natural, that is, to keep all these little fluctuations, but I want to flatten out the overall note, this is how I'll do it. You can see at the start, I've got a very sharp section of pitch. And if I grab the initial handle, and drag that just over that section, it's just like with the volume control, I can now just affect that bit, so I can flatten that out a little. And also on the end handle, if I drag it over to here, pop that down, you can see that's now a much flatter note.
In Demon's grounds.
If we zoom in a little bit, see there's a little bit of fluctuation here, so again, I'm just going to drag out my end handle and push that pitch down. Same goes for this note. Let's see what I can do to this. Grab the start handle, put that down a bit, and grab the end handle, put that down a bit there. So that's a slightly more consistent note. I might also want to reduce the overall variation here. So let's hear how these sound now.
In Demon's ground. In Demon's ground.
Okay, I actually think that I've done this note wrong now. I'm pretty sure that there should be a second note moving up through the scale just here. And I think this section which I pushed down was meant to be that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold Shift, which switches my tool temporarily to the cut tool. I'm also going to hold Alt, which will stop me snapping to the grid like this. And I'm going to cut it about here, as that looks like where he's trying to go up in pitch. And again, I'll just level out these notes a little. Maybe reduce the variation in this one. And we'll see how that sounds.
In Demon's ground.
Okay, so those notes themselves are sounding much better now, but now that they're more on the note, I can hear that there's some funny stuff going on with the notes themselves. It doesn't sound like it's in the right scale all the time. And I think that's mainly because this note has been sung flat. I actually think it should be up here.
In Demon's ground.
I also know from looking at the rest of this track that this note here is in the wrong place, as this key is not in the scale. However, this one is. And now that I've made a few changes, I'm also going to pull that down a bit, as I can see that started to run away. But let's hear how that sounds now.
In Demon's grounds. They're breaking floods of tears.
Much better. One of the functions I mentioned earlier which Newtone's had added to it this version is a vibrato editor mode. And you can hear and see in this note that he's tried to carry out some vibrato, but it's not particularly strong.
Grounds.
So what I want to do is I want to fix up this vibrato a bit. And the first way I'm going to go about this is I'm going to use the variation control to completely flatten out this note. This will allow me to use the vibrato editor to create some vibrato of my own. So I drag out these handles again so that they're not affecting the note, and then flatten it off. And again, fix that. So if we hear that note now, you can hear it sounds very dead and flat.
Grounds.
And obviously there is some fluctuation in the volume from where he's tried to carry out the vibrato. But what I'm going to do now is, since that note is now flat enough to start adding vibrato to, I'm going to go to the edit menu, and I'm going to switch from advanced edit pitch mode to advanced edit vibrato mode. So you can see now that the advanced edit mode has changed to this new control. Starting from the right, this blue control has two sections. Firstly, dragging it up or down controls the main amplitude for the vibrato, and that is how much pitch deviation there's going to be. It's not actually related to loudness. If I grab this little blue bar and drag it in, this now activates and controls the speed of the vibrato. So let's say I want it just there, and now I can set the vibrato amplitude. So let's have a listen to that.
Grounds.
You can also hear there that it fades in, and to control that, you grab this main section here, and that controls the start amplitude for the vibrato. And dragging it negatively, as you can see, will also cause it to start loud and fade out, which isn't a very natural effect, and you'll also want to tail that back a little bit.
Grounds.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set that so it fades in a little bit, and I'm also going to increase the frequency of this vibrato a bit. And we'll see how that sounds.
Grounds.
There we go, that's pretty easy to use. Another control that this has is the tremolo editor, and this allows you to control the amount of tremolo which follows the vibrato. As you already heard, once I flattened the note, the tremolo in the note was still there, despite the fact that the pitch deviations were gone. So this is going to allow me to match up the tremolo now to the speed of the actual vibrato I've added. Let's hear how that sounds.
In Demon's grounds.
So that sounds a bit more natural, although I am going to tail it back a little bit.
In Demon's grounds.
I also think I've managed to decrease the volume of the note along the way here. So I'm going to head back to my advanced edit mode and just increase the volume of the overall note.
In Demon's grounds. In Demon's grounds. They're breaking floods of tears.
So now that I've done that, I'm also going to do the same to this note, and you'll be able to see just how quick it can be. So I'm going to decrease the variation here. Then head over to my vibrato editor. Set my vibrato speed. And also set some tremolo to follow that. And we'll hear how that sounds.
Floods of tears.
And there we go. Overall, that's very easy to use. Another thing which is very handy to know for those of you who aren't really very confident with your music theory, and would have made my job a lot faster when I was working out where the notes should have been earlier, is the snap to scale function. Again, if we go to the edit menu, you can see there's a little box here called snap to scale. And if I head into the scale options panel, I can now set a scale to snap to. So for instance, I've got D sharp minor here, and if I tick snap to scale, now if I grab a note and try to move it around, it will only move within notes in that scale. And I thought that was a pretty cool thing to end on as an afternote for those of you who don't know your scales that well. Now that I've done some pitch correction on just these first two phrases, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this back into the playlist. So there's two ways I can do this. Firstly, I can click and drag the selection from here, or I can also click this box and it'll put it straight in for me. But if I mute off this track now, I'll just play the first two phrases as that's all I've touched here.
In demons' ground, they're breaking floods of tears.
So that sounds pretty good, and although I've kind of rushed through it and I haven't necessarily done the best job on every note in that section, it gives you an idea of the kinds of things you can do with Newtone. One final feature which was added in Newtone 2 is the time stretching mode, which is great for processing rhythmic stuff such as drums. For instance, if you've got a drums loop which is a bit out of time with your track and want to pull it into time, you can just chuck it into Newtone and run it through the time stretching mode to get all of the beats in time. Right here then, I've got the original unprocessed almond break, so it's got all of the time fluctuations and things which you wouldn't necessarily want if you're trying to use it in your music. As you can see here, I've already matched the tempo to the almond break, and I've also switched on my metronome so that you'll be able to hear when the beats are out of time with the grid. Let's have a listen to that then. There we go, right in the middle here, you can hear it goes way out over towards this end and then it pulls back into time at the end here. And that's something I would like to fix. So again, I'm going to bring it into Newtone. And the first thing I'm going to do, because that is loaded up in pitch correction mode, is go to the file menu and switch to time warping. And just hit no to that. Now it loads into the warping menu. Like I always do, I'm going to switch off the scroll to follow cursor, and all of these other controls are basically the same as they are in pitch correction mode, except for this one control here. The density control is basically a threshold for detecting transients. So if I switch that all the way down, you can see it doesn't detect any transients, it just sees this as one big transient. And if I start turning it up, you can see it starts detecting the loudest transients, and I keep going until it finds all of the transients which I want. So it's up full now, as you can see. It's still missed a few, but that's fine. I can just add in transients myself by double clicking. And to do it more accurately, I'll zoom all the way in and double click. You don't need to hold control to zoom in and out here, you can just use the mouse roller. And as before, if you want to zoom in on a section, just control and right click. Now there's a few ways which I can quantize this now. If I zoom in, all I need to do to put this beat, for instance, in time is grab it and drag it on. And I can do that for all of these if I want, but the fastest way to do it would just be to select all and hit Control Q, which quantizes everything. So if I hit slave playback to host, and I'm just going to mute off this for now. Now if I hit play, I'm going to hear whether that's got it right against the metronome. So that's not entirely perfect yet. Let's just have a little look through here. You can see it's slightly got this transient wrong here on this marker. So if I double click on the marker, it will remove it. And then I can double click on the transient and drag that into position. Much better. And I can do this all the way through. I'm not even going to bother adding on another marker just there, as that looks like it's more or less moved into time now. Just add one in there to pull it on, and I'm also going to shift this one. There we go. Let's see how that sounds. this one is out, so I'm going to pop that in. Also, that's not even transient, so I'm going to remove that, and I'll grab it there. Same deal here. In fact, that's moved straight on, so I'll leave that. Let's hear how that sounds against the metronome. There we go, that sounds much better. Let's pull that into the project now by clicking this button, and I'll close this down, and also close it in the inserts as it's currently tied to my timeline and I don't need it anymore. And there we go, it's now in the playlist. So that's it for this episode of Production Bytes. Thanks a lot for watching. I haven't even managed to cover every feature that Newtone has. I've just tried to cover the most important functions and some of their deeper functions where necessary. And therefore, if anyone does find anything I haven't mentioned here, then pop it down in the comments below and let the community know about it. But otherwise, thanks a lot for watching. And if you're in the market for any new samples and are also sick of hearing the almond break, which has been in every track for the last 20 years, we currently have our new sample pack out, Modern Breaks, which contains 2 GB of freshly recorded contemporary drum breaks. And there's a link on screen now and down in the description to check that out. But otherwise, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you next time on Production Bytes.